All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is the second half of Chapter 25's lecture. There we go. And hopefully you have all your stuff in front of you. You're ready to go. Okay, so let's do it. Alrighty, so last thing we talked about, I left off discussing the Watts Uprising, and let me just look at this slide for 1 second. Yeah, really just the shift in tone that the civil rights movement would take, specifically, during this time. So 65 to 67 is where that shift starts to really take place. And that's where we left off, okay? Much more of a radicalization, if you will. The earlier tone that was taken by Dr. King and other individuals like that who kind of focused on that Christian rhetoric, promoting this idea of peacefulness and brotherliness. Okay, with the Watts Uprising, that's where this radicalization shifts. And yeah, okay, so hold on 1 sec. Want my whistle to get ready. Okay, so with that change, we have people like Malcolm X entering the conversation, okay? So let me get my notes here in front of me. Okay, so Malcolm X. He had insisted that African Americans must control the political and economic resources of their communities and rely on their own efforts rather than working with Caucasians. He became a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. All right. And after a trip to Mecca, he began to speak of the possibility of interracial cooperation for change in the U.S. He was assassinated in 1965. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so after he was assassinated in 1965. After he split to create the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Okay, so he's assassinated, Dr. King is assassinated. So this is just an extremely violent time, okay? So let us look at the Black Power movement, okay? So the rise of Black Power. So Black Power as a slogan came about in 1966, suggested a range of concepts, but ultimately reflected this radicalization that we're talking about of young civil rights activists, and it sparked an explosion of racial self-assertion, okay? So this will become known as the Black Power movement. Inspired by the idea of African American self-determination, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee repudiated their previous interracialism, and new militant groups began to pop up, okay? So the Black Panther Party will be part of that movement of groups developing. So they're established in 1966. And then if you will look at this image, our next slide. So here's Malcolm X speaking in the top right corner, okay? In the lower right corner, this image is Black Panther members taking up arms, and I am having a brain fart and I cannot remember which building they are standing outside of. Sorry about that. Anyway, okay. But so taking up arms, and then we have this woman on the left who's holding a bag of flour, and this is to demonstrate the community organization that was going on, particularly within the Black Panther Party, other groups too, but specifically looking at the Black Panthers. But so, in neighborhoods across the country, they were organizing food drives for impoverished people, and so this woman is holding this bag of flour or meal, I should say. So that highlights that organization that was going on, okay? All right, so our civil rights movement is going on in the United States. It's growing, it's shifting, it's becoming radicalized during this time. And then, in addition to that, the Vietnam conflict begins to really grow. Coming out of World War II and the Korean War, we had talked about U.S. military involvement in Southeast Asia would remain rooted there during that time, and whenever we got to Vietnam again, we would see that. So between 1953 and now we're into the 60s, U.S. military involved, different operations, particularly in Vietnam. And so this is where, we'll start culminating into an actual war, okay? So let us get into that. Alrighty, so Vietnam and the New Left. Okay, we don't have to talk about the New Left too much, but this was a protest movement among Caucasian youth. So they were also involved in the civil rights movement as allies, but the New Left will really become the anti-war movement, okay? So we'll get into that. But so there's, again, just radicalization of different groups during this era. And so the New Left, it's part of that. Okay. Yeah, so kind of going off of the previous slide, we have groups like SDS being created in 1962. And I'm going to move forward just a little bit, okay? Yes, okay, so. Okay, so America and Vietnam. Okay, so what transformed student protest into a generational rebellion was Vietnam, which is kind of what I was saying just a second ago. And the fear that the public would not forgive them, as in our armed forces, for losing Vietnam made it impossible for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson to remove our troops from that area. And it just became increasingly tense, okay? Alrighty, so a pro-American South Vietnam, which was under Diem. This became problematic for American goals, and the U.S. approved a military coup to remove him from power, which led to his assassination. And that was actually in October of '63, so think about it. JFK is assassinated November 1963, so this was right before Kennedy's death. Okay, so that's early on. And then when Johnson comes into office, this then becomes his issue, which the Vietnam War will become known as Lyndon Johnson's War. Okay. So let us see why that is. Alrighty, so Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to repel armed attack in Vietnam. This is the beginning of the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution came out of an incident that it's questionable whether or not it occurred or how it actually played out, but the resolution was proposed because there was a quote-unquote attack on an American naval ship by a very small ship or fishing vessel that would not have been, a threat, very threatening, I should say. But anyway, whatever. Regardless of how it actually played out, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is passed and, gives the president this degree of power to fight against communism is what it comes down to, okay? Alrighty, so 1965, Johnson began airstrikes in Vietnam and introduced ground troops in South Vietnam. So 22,000 U.S. troops will be sent to the Dominican Republic. So think about fears of Cuba during this time, so that's tying into that. Okay, so by 1968, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam exceeded 500,000 people, and the conduct of war became more and more brutal, which, yeah, I guess we'll talk about that a little bit more because our next chapter, you know, is the tail end of the Vietnam conflict. Or not the tail end, sorry, but the third act, I guess. So yeah, more and more brutal as the war goes on. Okay, so we'll unfortunately see that. And the anti-war movement will continue to grow in the U.S., okay? This slide just says basically all of that. But yeah, as the war increases, demonstrations increase. SDS, who we talked about, they become more involved. By 1967, young men are burning their draft cards, people are fleeing to Canada, and the New Left, which I said becomes what represents the anti-war movement, is the youth counterculture that will represent the late 60s, okay? Alrighty. Okay, so personal liberation will come about also during all of these other conversations that we're having. During the 60s, personal liberation will tie into all of that. And it represented a search for a way of life in which friendship and pleasure eclipsed the single-minded pursuit of wealth. So that nuclear dream of suburban life, you know, your 2.3 children, you know, 2 cars in the garage, all that. So this would have been their parents' generation, so fighting against that, or counterculture. Yeah, so we have stuff like Woodstock happening. Okay, and then I'm going to move to our next slide. Okay, so the new movements, and so this will become known as the Rights Revolution. So, like I said, civil rights is going on, anti-war movement. We have things like the second wave of feminism coming about. So yeah, this is just our rights revolution, okay? So by the late 1960s, new social movements were dotting the political landscape. Feminism again becomes a conversation. Okay. So we have the Equal Pay Act. There are groups like NOW, the National Organization of Women, that is organized in 1966 with Betty Friedan acting as their first president, which she wrote The Feminine Mystique, she talked about last time. Okay, and this is the women's liberation movement, all right? We will get into this more as we get into the 70s, but okay, so let me just hit on this real quick. Okay, but yeah, so this is just our new feminism. Sorry, that's just a lot of me thinking towards the camera for a minute. But anyway, so like I said, we will get to women's liberation more as we get into the 70s, but taking control of one's self, our bodies, ourselves, birth control, the pill that is, will become a main focus for the second wave of feminism, equal pay, and expanding occupational opportunities for women. So that really marks our second wave, okay? Okay, so personal freedom is the next slide I'm gonna look at. Yeah, and so the personal as political becomes this rallying cry, which is still being discussed today because, you know, we're still discussing things like reproductive rights. Okay, so the personal is still political. This permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. So personal freedom, we're still discussing that. Okay. Alrighty. So radical feminists' first public campaign demanded the repeal of state laws that underscored women's lack of self-determination by banning abortions or leaving it up to physicians to decide whether a pregnancy should be terminated. Like I said, we're still having debates about that today in regards to personal freedom. And anyway, I'll just leave that there. But anyway, so this is our personal freedom entering the public consciousness, okay? All right, so let's move on to the gay liberation movement, which the catalyst event in sparking this, although other things had gone on prior to this, but, the Stonewall riot, whenever we hear about the beginning of widespread public acknowledgement of the gay rights movement, you usually hear it associated with the Stonewall riot, okay? Okay, but so one of the surprises of our rights revolution was the gay liberation movement. Homosexuality had long been stigmatized as sinful or as a mental disorder, and most states had laws in place against acts of homosexuality, okay? So whenever we look at the Stonewall riot, this happened in 1969 in New York, where the Stonewall Tavern was this bar that was run by the mafia, and the reason cops didn't go there was because it was mafia run, and there was this understanding, specifically with individuals of the LGBTQ community who went there, that it was kind of an open secret, if you will. But so the Stonewall Tavern was run by individuals who had this system set up with the cops that anywhere else. And there were still raids that were going on pretty regularly, where individuals would be arrested for, displaying, acts of homosexuality, however that was defined by whatever precinct you were in, right? But anyway, so this happens in 1969, and is the beginning of that aspect of things, okay? So we'll lead to our gay pride movement. In the 1970s, we'll start seeing our first pride parades coming about, okay? Okay, going along with our theme, let's talk about Latino activism during the 60s. Okay, so like Black Power, the Latino movement emphasized pride in both a Mexican past and a new Chicano culture. I should reiterate that this was taking place specifically within Mexican-American youths, okay? So, emphasizing a pride in their Mexican past and a new Chicano culture, which we talked about that the Zoot Suit riots, that new youth culture coming about, World War II and after, but so that's what I'm kind of still hitting on with that note, okay? But so, the aim of this generation is more related to labor struggles, okay? And this is where individuals like Cesar Chavez become prominent figures in this movement, okay? Ooh, my battery's getting low. All right, I'll have to speed it up. All righty. Okay, going off of that, we have AIM, which is the American Indian movement, all right? Just keeping in the tone of the time, all right? So, Alrighty, I'm going to look at our second and third bullet points here. But so Indigenous American activists demanded not simply economic aid, but greater self-determination. You know, you have to think about everything we've talked about all semester, from the beginning with the Dawes Act and allotment and boarding schools and assimilation and all of that. Okay, this has been going on generations. Okay, so the way it was justified by at the federal level was that economic aid was being provided to First Nations, and so that was all that they could do. That, you know, anything else was beyond their means. Okay, so in the 1960s, the AIM, let's say the AIM movement, but that doesn't make sense. AIM began really fighting against that pattern of being simply provided economic aid. Okay, so yeah, moving towards greater self-determination. The term American Indian Movement comes about in 1968, and it represented, quote, Indians of all tribes. So this was a, what am I looking at? A Pan-American identity, okay? There is also the occupation of Alcatraz during this, which I don't have, 1972 I do believe, but I didn't make a, well, no, I guess it would have had to have been 68 as well. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, there's the occupation of Alcatraz, the island in San Francisco Bay. All right. So, all right. And because my phone is starting to die, I will get through these last things a little quicker. Again, going with the tone of the time, there are also movements like environmentalism, which is something we still talk about today. We're talking about it more and more. There's also the consumer movement and making sure that goods that go out to the general public are safe. You know, this is why we have recalls today, and we have things like seatbelts and airbags, okay? So consumer movement comes about. Okay, but yeah, so all of these things, every movement that I just went through is all part of the rights revolution, like I said. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to word. I need to mention that. Okay, well, anyway, so the federal courts throughout the 1960s are still very much focused on anti-communism. They are trying to they're trying to protect the quote-unquote sanctity of the old way, if you will. But anyway, so there are, with our rights revolution, there is, you know, obviously there's going to be a response to that, but so this will just influence a greater and greater conversation about these things, which will continue into our next chapter. But so, okay. We have things, yeah, throughout the 1960s, like I said, our courts, stuff like the freedom of the press becomes a huge talking point, because as we're talking about civil liberties, you know, there will be an ebb and flow of support, but so things like that come about. And this also leads us into the right to privacy. Again, think Cold War, all right? Okay, so there's the case Griswold versus Connecticut. So overturned a state law prohibiting, oh, I got ahead of myself. Okay, sorry. Anyway, well, now I lost my train of thought. Sorry, Griswold versus Connecticut is about birth control. And I got ahead of myself and forgot that we need to talk about that for 1 sec. Okay, so our right to privacy, this does tie into the Cold War because it will come into question at different levels throughout this whole time, going up through the 80s too, okay? But in regards to the right to privacy, one's reproductive organs completely relate to that, okay? So that's my tie-in back to reproductive rights, okay? But so, there is the case, Griswold versus Connecticut, which overturned a state law prohibiting the use of contraceptives. And the Warren Court outlined entirely new rights in response to the rapidly changing contours of American society, which leads to Roe v. Wade, which created a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy. Okay, so very important Supreme Court case that, is still talked about today and is being discussed, right in the middle of this election season. Okay, alrighty, so now then we can look at the larger picture of 1968. Alrighty, so the Tet Offensive. All right. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese launched a series of uprisings in South Vietnam. This will be known as the Tet Offensive. And, all right, so looking at Lyndon Johnson, he withdrew from the 1968 election. Dr. King's assassinated. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother. The Chicago Democratic National Convention occurs. It basically becomes a riot. Okay. Okay, and then this will take us into the Nixon era. All right. And that is really where our next chapter will take us. So I'm just going to save discussing Richard Nixon until we get to that point, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and upload this and let my phone charge before it dies and this video disappears forever, okay? That is it for chapter 25. I'll be back for chapter 26. If you guys have any questions, shoot me an email and I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.